Good evening. We've been looking at Jesus a little bit on Sunday night in our character study, and I've been doing Jesus on Sunday morning, and there's just a lot to do with it. So anyway, if you're saying Sunday morning, Sunday night, you're getting a double dose. But tonight we're going to talk about the cross a little bit and about the journey, because we often speak of it, but we don't really take time to look at it in its entirety and look at it chronologically. And it's kind of hard to do because we have to look at synoptic gospels, we have to look at John's gospel, we have to try to put it all in some kind of an order that makes sense, some sort of a chronological order that makes sense. And so we're going to look at that a little bit, probably the next couple of Sunday nights. You know, Jesus said in John 3:13 through 14, he says, "No one has ascended into heaven but he who descended from heaven, the Son of Man. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up." You know, Jesus knew the death he would die, and there's reasoning behind the death he would die. One thing, it was public. It was something everybody could see. Everybody could witness. Didn't say, well, he died and you didn't see it. Everybody saw Jesus die upon the cross. It was a public event. It was a time in history when crucifixion was a thing. Jesus came at the right time. Crucifixion throughout history hasn't always been a thing. But at the time of the Romans, it was a way of capital punishment, and it was well used, and it was something that Jesus was very familiar with. The people of the day were very familiar with. Jesus certainly wasn't the only person that was ever crucified upon a cross in Rome. There were thousands crucified upon crosses in Rome. It was a common form of execution, something they were very familiar with. In John 12, he was saying this to indicate by what kind of death which he was to die. The crowd then answered him, "We have heard out of the law that the Christ is to remain forever. How can you say the Son of Man must be lifted up?" Who is this Son of Man? And we've been looking at some Old Testament prophecy on Sunday morning and how the Jews viewed it, how the Jews viewed the Messiah. And this is one thing, his kingdom must remain forever. That's 2 Samuel 7, right? Amongst other places in the Old Testament. But 2 Samuel said his kingdom would be eternal, his kingdom would be forever, his throne would be established forever. How can he die and that throne be established forever? How can this make sense? Who is this Son of Man? They said. Who is this guy? Jesus oftentimes, especially in John's Gospel, referred to as the Son of Man. Other places referred to as the Son of God. Who is this? Paul says in Galatians 3, "Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us, for it is written, 'Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree.'" And that comes out of Deuteronomy 21. Where it says, "The corpse shall not hang all night on the tree, but you shall surely bury him on the same day. For he who is hanged is accursed of God, so that you do not defile your land, which the Lord your God gives you an inheritance." So it's an Old Testament idea. To be crucified was to be accursed of God. Paul says in Galatians, Jesus became a curse for us, having been hung upon the tree or hung upon the cross. And so this idea of being lifted up from the earth is an idea, to be lifted up, to draw all men to me. We know the story, don't we? The betrayal by Judas of Jesus. The times examined, actually 4 times examined instead of 3 here, 4 times examined by different people. Actually, you could make an argument 5 times, actually. 5 times examined if you really wanted to say. I don't know why I put 3 there, but he was examined multiple times, cross-examined. The journey to the cross for Christ was a long event. It was agonizingly long. He was tired, he was thirsty, he was hungry. We've heard these stories, we've read them, they're in our mind. We know the condition that he was in. But to look at this, Jesus was first brought bound before Annas. That's only in John, and it's kind of confusing a little bit if you really study the text and study history, because technically he wasn't high priest. High priest should be high priest for life, but Annas is not. John is very specific here, which some find difficult to reconcile with the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Annas was appointed high priest by the legate Quirinius, and we read about him in the birth of Jesus, right? Quirinius. In AD 6, approximately at the same time, Archelaus, the ethnarch, was removed from office and sent into exile. He was one who fell out of favor, if we've ever studied the Herods. Normally, Annas should have held that office for life, but the procurator, Valerius Gratus, Pilate's predecessor, found him intolerable and disposed him in AD 15. The high priesthood under Roman rule became very political. Rome wanted somebody they could manipulate, a high priest they could manipulate to control the Jews. So the priesthood should have been for life, should have been of the lineage of Aaron, and that's how God set it up, that they would keep it for life and it would pass on to the next son. But since they're no longer a free nation underneath Roman rule, Rome was involved in procuring and setting high priests. It's one reason that the Jews realized, or a lot of Jews realized, that God had departed from the temple, because the high priest should have not been able to go in and do Day of Atonement, should not have been able to go in and do that because he wasn't the right high priest, but he got away with it, right? So they kind of understood that God had kind of deserted them in a sense. Brown, this is a commentary, is undoubtedly correct, concluding that although it was unstated, Annas was still called high priest because Josephus had no difficulty. That's Flavius Josephus, the historian, who wasn't a Christian, who was a Jew, describing events in which he was involved long after being disposed. There's no reason to think that Annas would not be involved in such a hearing, as some scholars have brought. Even a few manuscripts sought to alter the presence of such an early hearing before Annas, but these are later attempts. It says the statement that Caiaphas high priest that year is not meant to suggest the high priest changed every year. Rather that for John it meant in the determinative year of salvation in world history, Caiaphas was the high priest. He would be remembered for what he did. There were 5 family members of that family who held that position. So even though Rome was putting him out of office, they still had influence. Jesus went before him first because he had a lot of support. He was taken to the palace of Annas and Caiaphas, followed by Peter and another, which we assume to be John, and there's argument to be made for that. He's examined before Caiaphas and the council. So, things moved fairly quickly for Jesus. And you got to remember, they arrest him at night, so it's nighttime. They go to the garden. Judas betrays him with a kiss. They take him to Annas first. That would be before daylight. They take him to Caiaphas probably before daylight. When daylight gets here, they're going to take him before Caiaphas and the council. So that gets us up to the point of Matthew. The high priest stood up and said to him, "Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?" But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you're the Christ, the Son of God. In Matthew, we get Son of God. Jesus said to him, "You have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his robes and said, "He's blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? Behold, we have now heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" And they answered, "He deserves death." So, Jesus was largely silent, wasn't he? That comes out of Isaiah 53, as a lamb silent before his shears. Jesus largely didn't defend himself. He answered very pointedly, very matter-of-factly. He turned it against them like Jesus always did. You've said it, not to deny it, but yet again, in some ways, not necessarily to affirm it. You've rightly said it. He was mocked. Tearing his clothes, the high priest said, "What further need do we have witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you?" They all condemned him to be deserving of death, and some began to spit on him and to blindfold him and to beat him with their fists and to say to him, "Prophesy." And the officers received him with slaps in the face. No defense here for Jesus on the way to the cross. Nobody to stand up for him. He was alone. He was deserted, and it's this point in the story, chronologically, that Peter makes his denial, the daybreak. Jesus makes his denial, the rooster crows. And Peter has denied Jesus 3 times and goes out and weeps bitterly. Jesus is a long ways from the cross at this particular point in history. The journey has just begun for him. So he's been examined. Peter has denied him. In the day, the council of elders, the people assembled. So daybreak, denial of Peter. So he's been before Annas. He's been before Caiaphas. Peter's denied him at the break of day. That's when the rooster generally crows, if you've ever had roosters. Some roosters don't know when the break of day is. We generally kill those roosters. But generally they crow at the break of day, right? And so now it's daylight. They've assembled. The elders have assembled, the council, the chief priests, the scribes, led him away to the council chamber. "If you are the Christ, tell us." He said to them, "If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask a question, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God. They said, are you the Son of God then? He said to them, yes, I am. Jesus very seldom admitted to this, but at the cross, right before the cross, he did several times. I am the guy. I am he. And they said, what further need do we have a testimony? For we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth. At this point, the Jews knew they had to move him to Roman jurisdiction. There's a problem with this, inherently, and that's that it's a Sabbath. It's Passover. Now, I have a little different view of when Sabbath was than the Catholics do, but it was definitely a Sabbath. And so it was a high Sabbath, the Bible says. It was Passover Sabbath, which doesn't necessarily, in Jewish thought, mean that it had to be a Saturday, okay? So it was a high Sabbath. And so they need to go. They need to take him to the Roman where he gets a formal trial. They took him to there. They showed him before that. They've heard it from their mouth. And at this point, Judas is going to go commit suicide. Judas has his regrets. Judas throws the money on the temple floor, goes out, hangs himself, and Judas commits suicide. So Judas is not even going to witness this whole event. Judas is going to commit suicide before this even occurs. So Judas is not even going to witness everything. And they take him to Pilate. And I have to use John. I really like John before Pilate more than I do the synoptics before Pilate. They led Jesus from Caiaphas into the Praetorium. It was early. They themselves did not enter so that they would not be defiled, something we don't think about sometimes. They knew they couldn't enter because it was a court of a Gentile. And if they would have entered the court of the Gentile, they would have been unclean for Sabbath, which would have been high Sabbath, Passover. This is Passover, preparation, day of preparation. So they had to stay out of it. So they actually stood in the street. Jesus was brought into the Praetorium, or Pilate's hall, as we sometimes call it. And Pilate went out to them and said, what accusation do you bring against this man? And they answered and said to him, if this man were not an evildoer, we'd not have delivered him. So Pilate said, take him yourselves, judge him according to your law. And the Jews said, we're not committed to put anyone to death, to fulfill the word of Jesus, which he spoke, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die. Remember, it's in John's gospel that he said, if I be lifted up, I will draw men to myself, that I needed to be lifted up. So John is reasserting this as he's before Pilate, the idea that they needed to crucify him. Now, the Jews killed Stephen and got away with it, stoned him to death, book of Acts, right? So the Jews had a lot of leeway. Rome was really good about turning away from what the Jews did. They didn't want to really anger the Jews. There were a lot of Jews in Jerusalem. Sometimes it was easier just to look the other way and let them do their thing than it was to say, oh, you can't do that, right? So when they stoned Stephen, even though, as it says here, they weren't allowed to put anyone to death, the Jews, the Romans, looked the other direction. But they couldn't do this with Jesus. It wouldn't fulfill Scripture. It wouldn't be public. It wouldn't be something that people could see. Jesus had to be lifted up according to the Scripture. Couldn't be stoned. So there's a process. And you got to understand, I think it's important we understand that God's behind this process. It's a predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God. And he says, Pilate entered again into the Praetorium, summoned Jesus. So Pilate, in the story, he's going in and out because the Jews are in the street. And so he's going in, talking to Jesus, going out, talking to the Jews, going in, talking to Jesus. He's making a lot of trips back and forth here because they won't come into the hall. And he says, are you the king of the Jews? And it's actually one of my favorite little parts of this narrative. And he says, are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me? And Pilate answered, and I like Pilate's sarcasm, I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priest delivered you to me. What have you done? Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would be fighting, so as not be handed over to Jews. So not be handed over to the Jews, but as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. Therefore Pilate said to him, so you are a king. Jesus answered, you say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. And Pilate said to him, what is truth? When he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no guilt in him. So Pilate once again is going back and forth. He goes out to the Jews. There's no guilt in him. I find no reason to put him to death. And then Jesus goes before Herod. This is Herod Antipas, if you studied the Herods. Herod Antipas is the Herod, the king of Galilee, not the king of Judea, king of Galilee. But Herod Antipas is in Jerusalem because of Passover. So he's able to take Jesus before, because Jesus is a Galilean, right? So he wouldn't go before Agrippa. He would go before Antipas. So Herod Antipas is who this is. Jesus is going to go before him because he's the king of Galilee. And he's in Jerusalem because of Passover. So Pilate sends him. Is that as far as that goes? Did I not get the whole thing? Oh, well, you're going to take it with me from here then. So Jesus takes him before Herod. And Herod, he wanted to see Jesus. And the reason he wanted to was because he knew of him, he had heard of him, but he never had really met him. And Herod wanted to see a miracle, is what Herod wanted. Herod thought, boy, if I put Jesus before me, and Herod comes before me, and I get to question him, I get to see him, and Herod does this, then I will get to see a miracle. And so Jesus is brought before Herod. And of course, Jesus gives up very little to Herod. Jesus knows his journey. I think it's interesting in this whole narrative, this whole story, the quickness, how quick this all takes place. Carrying him back and forth, walking him through the streets of Jerusalem with the Jews in hot pursuit, right? Taking him before one after the other to have him tried, to put him before Pilate. And if we go back into John's gospel, after he leaves Herod, he is going to be taken back to Pilate. It's Pilate who eventually is going to have jurisdiction over him because of the way that he is. Pilate will have that. When he comes back before Pilate, he's given a choice for Barabbas, the robber, the thief, the murderer. It's Jewish custom to set one free during the Passover. Who would you have me set free to you? Barabbas or Jesus? What choice would you make? The murderer or Jesus? And of course, you know the choice they made. I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you wish that I released for you the King of the Jews? So they cried out again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. If you really look at this in the Greek, and you look at this synoptically, Barabbas was really a murderer. He was really more than a robber. He was a really bad guy. He was the worst, right? Who do you want? This worst guy, this worst enemy of you, or do you want this? Mark 15 tells us about the scourging of Jesus, kind of in a non-chronological place. But in John's gospel, in John 19, Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. He wanted to appease them. He didn't still want to send Jesus to the cross. He wanted to make them make a decision, and scourging was awful. And I've never seen it. I saw it on Passion of the Christ. That's one movie I'll watch one time. I saw that movie. I think that's pretty accurate, if you've ever saw that movie. It was graphic. It was terrible. It was violent. It was bloody. It was unbelievable to see that it happened. When I think about Paul being scourged, Paul being beaten. Beaten with rods is one thing. Scourged was another thing. They'd already slapped him. They'd already put a crown of thorns upon his head. They had already mocked him. Now they were going to scourge him. Pilate was trying to make them release him. He wanted the Jews to give up the deal. He didn't want necessarily to crucify Jesus. And this was a measure I think he took in order to make this happen. They put a purple robe on him, and they began to coming to him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews, and to give him slaps in the face. And Pilate come out again and said, Behold, I am bringing him out to you, so that you may know that I find no guilt in him. And Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, Behold the man. So when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, Crucify, crucify. And Pilate said to him, Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. And the Jews answered and said, we have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he has made himself out to be the Son of God. Why do they say that? What in the law says that? What are they, the blaspheme, saying you're God, but to say you're the Son of God? But the Jews, it was one and the same thing. To say you were the Son of God or to say you were God, it was the same idea to them. They didn't see a distinction in that. Jesus had provoked them to that multiple times throughout his ministry. When Jesus says, I am, he made himself out to be God. And the Jews understood that and put him to an equality with God. Jesus says, only God can forgive sins, and yet he had healed people, and they attributed that to sin in their lives, that Jesus had forgiven their sins, and Jesus hadn't denied that. Jesus says, what would be easier for me to say? Take up your bed and walk, or your sins be forgiven me. Jesus denial of that idea. So the idea of Jesus being God, being able to forgive sins, was ingrained within them, and they understood Jesus to be God, and that was blaspheme. Who can make themselves out to be God but God? Jews, they didn't understand. They couldn't understand, and I don't think we would have understood if we would have been there, the scope of what was going on. They had no idea, and we wouldn't have had an idea. This was playing out according to God, and Jesus was this pawn in the middle of this thing that he had to go through. And we spoke about that this morning, Jesus being the Prince of Peace. Jesus could have resisted. Jesus could have defended himself, could have called angels, could have done so many things that you and I would have done if we'd have been in the place of Christ. And yet we see the peace, the confidence within him. It was the inner man of Jesus that was able to sustain this punishment. Jesus was proven under fire. The Hebrew writer says, tested, tried in all ways that we are, tempted in all ways that we are, and yet without sin. Jesus was the man who without sin went to the cross. Sometimes we forget that it was Jesus, this human God, this human side of God, that went to the cross, the one who didn't want to go, who prayed, let this cup depart from me, and yet here he was in the middle, and it was probably a lot worse than he had even imagined. Pilate was afraid, more afraid. Didn't want to do it. If he's God, I don't want to crucify him, don't want to hang him on a cross. Why would you want to hang God on the cross? That's a bad thing. I mean, Romans were pluralistic people. They had no problem with God being God. That was fine with them. They didn't deny him. They just believed there was probably a lot more than just him. So you don't want to crucify a God. Why would you want to hang a God upon a tree? And from a Roman standpoint, it's even more scary because they believed that gods came down to, that was kind of Roman mythology. So he's afraid, deathly afraid. His wife's been warned in a dream, and you know that story. Where are you from? Interesting statement to Jesus. Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate said to him, you do not speak to me? Do you not know I have authority to release you and I have authority to crucify you? Don't you know I'm the one in power? And yet Jesus says, oh no. Jesus says, no, you're not in power at all. He says, you would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin. Boy, that's quite a statement, isn't it? Who hung Jesus on the cross? Pilate or the Jews? Who crucified him? Jesus answers the question. They have the greater sin. They're the ones who put me upon the cross. But if you really think about it, we put him on a cross, didn't we? You know, sometimes we forget that. You can't blame them, in a way, for what they did. I mean, God kind of said it was going to happen that way, right? They weren't duped. They weren't misled. They were maybe uninformed, maybe didn't see Christ for who Christ really was, and we spoke a lot about that. But they were wrong. I think the statement in the street kind of sums it up, doesn't it? When they were in the street and they said, let his blood be on us and on our children. You know, I've often thought how prophetic the statement that was. You know, their idea is we'll accept the guilt. We'll accept the punishment. Let his blood be on our hands. In other words, not on yours, on us. We'll take the guilt. because we're the ones who decided to put him on the cross. But I always thought how prophetic, because his blood is on us and on our children, right? And isn't that what Peter said on Pentecost when he says the promises to you and your children? Remember that out of Joel? And all who are far off, as many as our God shall call to himself. Well, the promise was the blood of Jesus Christ, the salvation of Jesus. And in a way, even though they said, let his blood be on us to accept the guilt, it was fascinating to me that on the day of Pentecost, when Peter stood up and says, you've crucified the Son of Man, and they said, what shall we do? How shall we get rid of this guilt? And the answer Peter basically gave was, the very blood, the very guilt you said is on you because of his blood, is the blood that will cleanse you, and the blood that will forgive you, and the blood that will give you a home in heaven. Very prophetic. I think it's an interesting idea for you and I to consider. We'll look at this a little more. But I think it's interesting as we get to this point in the narrative, point in the story, that the blood of Christ comes into view. From the scourging to the thorns, to the proclamation, let his blood be on us, to the blood that flows from the cross that heals the world. Isn't it fascinating? God is fascinating. This story is beyond belief, and yet true. And it's the crux of what we as Christians hold dear. If there's any way that we can help you this evening, would you let it be known while we stand?